They arrested her for gardening. They thought she was just an old black woman. "Step away from the property. Hands where I can see them. Now." The voice cut across the morning stillness like a blade through silk. A 74-year-old woman in a faded church dress knelt in her own garden, trowel frozen mid-dig, soil crumbling from her arthritic fingers. She had been tending these begonias for 35 years. The deputy standing on her lawn had been alive for 28. He didn't know her name. Didn't know she'd paid off this house in 1989. Didn't know her late husband had once extracted hostages from a jungle compound while bleeding from 3 separate wounds. He saw a black woman in a white neighborhood. That was enough. "Officer, I live here." The words came out soft, raspy with age and the early hour. 6:15 a.m. The sprinklers 2 doors down hissed their mechanical rhythm. Somewhere, a dog barked once and fell silent. The deputy's hand moved to his holster. Not drawing, just resting. A reminder of who held power in this equation. "I said hands. Are you deaf?" She raised them slowly. The trowel dropped into the mulch. Her knuckles were swollen, twisted by decades of arthritis and night shifts gripping surgical instruments. She'd spent 40 years as an ICU nurse, stitching together the broken and bleeding. Now her own hands trembled in the morning light, while a stranger demanded she prove she belonged in her own yard. The radio on his shoulder crackled, dispatch confirming his location. "Unit 14, 2847 Magnolia Lane. Suspicious individual. Caller, Ashworth Pamela." The deputy smiled. Not warmth, satisfaction. "Dispatch, I've got visual on the subject. Black female, elderly, refusing to comply with lawful orders." She hadn't refused anything, but that wouldn't matter. Not in the report he was already writing in his head. If you're enjoying this story, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss what happens next. The morning had started like every other morning for the past 5 years since Declan passed. 5:30 a.m. Eyes open before the alarm. A moment of stillness in the bed that still felt too large, too empty, too quiet without the steady rhythm of his breathing beside her. Then movement, routine. The architecture of grief built one small ritual at a time. Opal Satterfield, Ollie to anyone who'd known her more than a week, swung her legs over the edge of the mattress and felt the familiar protest of joints that had logged too many miles, too many 12-hour shifts, too many years of bending over hospital beds and kneeling in garden soil. The kettle first. Always the kettle. Yorkshire Gold, loose leaf, the way Declan had taught her when they'd first married, and she'd made the mistake of serving him a cup of Lipton. The look on his face, betrayal, actual betrayal, as if she'd suggested they burn the Union Jack. She smiled at the memory while the water heated. The kitchen window faced east, catching the first pink fingers of dawn. Through it she could see her garden.
The begonias were coming in strong this year, deep crimson, the color of old wine. Declan had planted the original bulbs in 1992. She'd maintained them ever since. The house was modest. Single-story bungalow, 1,200 square feet. White siding that needed repainting every few years. They'd bought it in 1989 when the neighborhood was mixed and the prices were low, and nobody looked twice at an interracial couple moving in. Declan had paid cash. She'd never asked where the money came from. There were parts of his work she'd learned not to question. On the porch, 2 flags hung from matching poles. The stars and stripes on the left, the Union Jack on the right. New neighbors sometimes asked about it. She'd learned to say her husband was British.
Most people left it at that. The tea finished steeping. She carried it to the small table by the window, the one covered in seed catalogs and old photographs. Her favorite picture sat in a silver frame. Their wedding day, 1971. She'd been 21, terrified and radiant in her mother's altered dress. Declan had been 24, lean and serious in a borrowed suit, looking at her like she was the only solid thing in a world made of smoke. No uniform in the photo. He'd been careful about that. Always careful. She sipped her tea and watched the light change. 6 a.m. Time for the garden. The work gloves lived in the same drawer they'd occupied for 3 decades. Canvas, worn soft, smelling of soil and something floral she could never quite identify. She pulled them on, the way she pulled on armor. Familiar weight, familiar purpose. The front door opened onto a porch swing and a view of Magnolia Lane. Quiet street. Established trees. The kind of neighborhood real estate agents called charming when they meant expensive now. 3 houses down, the Ashworth place gleamed with fresh paint and meticulous landscaping. Pamela Ashworth had moved in 4 years ago, shortly after her divorce, and had immediately appointed herself guardian of the neighborhood's aesthetic standards. She'd joined the HOA board within 6 months, chaired the Historic Character Committee by the end of her first year. Opal had received her first citation 3 weeks after Pamela's arrival. Unapproved flower colors. The begonias were too red, apparently, not in keeping with the neighborhood's heritage palette. She'd ignored the citation, and the next one, and the one after that. Pamela had stopped sending them eventually. But she hadn't stopped watching. The garden tools lived in a small shed by the side of the house. Opal gathered her trowel, her pruning shears, her knee pad. The arthritis made kneeling difficult, but she'd rather hurt than give up this small daily communion with the earth. 6:15 a.m. The sprinklers at the Henderson place kicked on, right on schedule. A dog barked somewhere. The morning was ordinary in every way that mattered. She knelt in the soil, began loosening the dirt around the begonia roots, hummed something low and tuneless, a habit from years of night shifts when humming kept you awake through the worst of the graveyard hours. The cruiser appeared at 6:17. She didn't hear it at first. Her hearing wasn't what it used to be, and the soil absorbed sound, and she was focused on a stubborn weed that had threaded its roots through her prize specimens. The shadow fell across her before she registered the engine. She looked up. Black and white paint. County Sheriff's seal. A young man climbing out, hand already moving toward his belt. Step away from the property. Hands where I can see them. Now. The words didn't make sense. Not at first. She was in her own garden, wearing her own gloves, kneeling in soil she'd turned 10,000 times. The disconnect between his tone and her reality created a gap her mind couldn't bridge. "Officer, I live here." He didn't acknowledge the statement, didn't pause, didn't ask a follow-up question. His boots crushed her grass as he approached, heavy footfalls that would leave marks in the morning dew. "I said hands. Are you deaf?" She raised them. The trowel fell. Her knees protested as she tried to stand, and she stayed kneeling instead, which seemed to make him angrier. "You deaf and crippled? Get up." "My knees." She kept her voice level, calm, the way she'd learned to speak to agitated patients, to frightened families, to men in authority who didn't like being questioned. "I have arthritis. If you'll give me a moment, I'll give you 5 seconds." He grabbed her arm. The grip was wrong. Too high, too tight, fingers digging into the soft tissue above her elbow, where the nerves clustered and the pain bloomed instant and sharp. She gasped. Her body twisted instinctively away from the source of the hurt, and that twist became evidence. "Stop resisting." "I'm not—" "I said stop resisting." He wrenched her upward. Her left knee buckled. The hip replacement from 2017 screamed a warning she couldn't heed. She felt herself falling before she understood she was no longer standing, and then the ground came up fast and hard, and her cheek hit the brick edging of the flower bed, and her glasses flew somewhere she couldn't see, and the world dissolved into pain and confusion and the taste of blood in her mouth. "Look what you made me do." She couldn't see his face, couldn't see anything clearly without her glasses, but she heard his voice, annoyed rather than concerned, as if she'd spilled coffee on his paperwork. The handcuffs clicked around her wrists behind her back. Cold metal. Too tight. Her shoulders wrenched into an unnatural position, and she cried out, and he pulled tighter. "Officer." She forced the word through the shock, through the blood, through the surreal certainty that this could not be happening, not here, not now, not to her. "Officer, my identification is inside the house, on the kitchen table. Please, I can prove I live here." "Sure you can." He hauled her upright by the cuffs, and the angle sent fire through her shoulder sockets. "They all can. Every junkie, every vagrant, every trespasser, all got a story, all got an excuse." A voice from somewhere nearby, thin, frightened. "Officer? Officer, that's Opal. She lives there. She's lived there for 35 years. Delphine Coates. Neighbor since 1991. Retired teacher, 78 years old and standing on her porch in a bathrobe, witnessing something she couldn't possibly be seeing. The deputy turned toward the voice. His hand left Opal's arm and went to his belt, unsnapping the holster strap over his taser. "Back inside, ma'am. This doesn't concern you." "But she's—" "I said back inside, unless you want to join her." Delphine's door closed. The lock clicked. And Opal understood, with the clarity that comes only in moments of complete helplessness, that she was alone. The cruiser's back seat smelled of vomit and fear and something chemical that might have been cleaning solution, or might have been something worse. The plastic was hard beneath her. The cuffs bit into her wrists. She couldn't sit upright without her shoulders screaming, so she slumped sideways, cheek pressed against the window, watching her house recede in the side mirror. Her begonias were still there, unwatered, unfinished. The trowel lying in the dirt where she'd dropped it. "Please." Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, thin, old. "Please, at least let me water them before we go. They'll die in this heat." He laughed. She hadn't known until that moment that a laugh could contain cruelty, but this one did. It lived in the vowels, curled around the consonants like barbed wire around a fence post. "Lady, you're worried about flowers? You're going to jail. Maybe worry about that." For what crime? Trespassing, resisting arrest, assaulting an officer. The last one hit like a physical blow. Assault. She hadn't touched him, hadn't raised a hand, hadn't done anything except fall when he'd pulled her off balance. "I didn't assault anyone." "Your word against mine." He met her eyes in the rearview mirror. Young face, hard eyes. The kind of certainty that came from never having been wrong, or never having been held accountable for wrongness. "And lady, I got a body cam. You want to argue about what's on there?" She didn't answer. She'd worked in hospitals long enough to know how footage could lie, how angles could distort, how 10 seconds of context could disappear and leave behind a narrative that served whoever controlled the editing suite. The cruiser turned onto Main Street, past the coffee shop where she and Declan had shared scones every Saturday for 2 decades, past the pharmacy where she still picked up her blood pressure medication, past the library where she volunteered on Thursday afternoons. Nobody looked twice. Just another sheriff's car. Just another day. She closed her eyes and let herself disappear into the dark behind her lids. The pain was everywhere now. Shoulder, wrists, face, knee. But deeper than the physical hurt was something colder. The understanding that she had lived 74 years in a country that had never quite decided she belonged, that she had married a hero, buried him with full honors, maintained his home and his garden and his memory. And none of it mattered. Not here. Not now. Not to the young man in the front seat who had already decided what she was based on a single glance. The station appeared on the right, low building, brown brick. The Sycamore Falls Sheriff's Office, where her taxes had been paying salaries for 35 years. The deputy parked, opened her door, grabbed her arm in the same too-tight grip, and hauled her out without checking if her feet were steady beneath her. They weren't. She stumbled. Her knee gave. She caught herself against the car's frame only because his grip kept her partially upright. Walking too slow. He pushed her forward, and the push was hard enough that she staggered, fought for balance, lost it, caught herself on the building's brick wall with her cuffed hands taking the impact behind her back. Inside, the air was cold and smelled of old coffee and something floral that was trying too hard to mask something sour. A desk sergeant looked up, 40-ish, tired eyes, the kind of face that had stopped being surprised by anything long ago. "Hensley, what do you got?" The deputy, Hensley she now knew, pushed her forward again. "Trespasser. Found her casing a house on Magnolia. Wooden ID got physical when I tried to detain her." The desk sergeant's eyes moved to her face, to the blood drying on her cheek, to the raw scrapes on her palms where she'd caught herself on the brick. She do that to herself? Fell, resisting. Something flickered in the sergeant's expression. Not doubt exactly. More like the careful absence of doubt that comes from years of choosing not to see what's in front of you. "Book her. Holding cell 2. The processing took an hour. Fingerprints, photograph. Her belongings, watch, ring, the laminated prayer card in her pocket, sealed in a plastic bag and tagged with a number. She asked 3 times for a phone call, twice for medical attention, once for water. The answers were all the same. Later, the cell was 8 feet by 10. Concrete bench, metal toilet without a seat, a smell that suggested the drain hadn't been cleaned this century. She lowered herself onto the bench. The cold seeped through her dress immediately, but she didn't have the strength to stand. Her watch was gone. They'd taken it. The 40th anniversary gift Declan had given her, the one she'd worn every day since 2011, the one that still kept perfect time despite being 15 years old. Without it, she had no way to mark the hours. Only the changing quality of light through the small window near the ceiling. Morning became afternoon became evening, and nobody came. Her shoulder had stopped screaming and started throbbing. Her wrists were numb where the cuffs had cut in. The blood on her face had dried to a crust she couldn't wipe away without water. She thought about Declan. About the nights he'd come home from wherever he'd been. She never asked, he never said, looking like a man who'd walked through fire and somehow not burned. About the way he'd sit in the garden afterward, just breathing, just existing, letting the silence and the begonias pull him back from whatever edge he'd approached. "You don't fix it," he'd told her once, years into their marriage. "The things you see, the things you do, you don't fix them, you just learn to carry them." She was learning now, carrying this cell, this pain, this quiet certainty that she'd been erased, that her name and her history and her 48 years of marriage to a man who'd bled for 2 countries meant nothing to the people who controlled this space. The door clanged somewhere down the hall. Footsteps. Heavy, confident, unhurried. Hensley appeared outside her bars. Off duty now, she could tell. The uniform was rumpled. The attitude was worse. "Still here?" She didn't answer. "Thought your people would have bailed you out by now. Where's all your friends from the neighborhood?" Silence. "Oh, right." He leaned against the bars, close enough that she could smell the beer on his breath. "Your neighbors don't actually know you, do they? Because you don't belong there. Never did. Just pretending. Playing house in a place that was never yours. I'd like my phone call now. You'll get it when I say you get it. That's not how the law works." He smiled. The same smile from the garden, the one that contained cruelty the way a jar contains poison. "Lady, in here, I'm the law and you're nothing. You're a number. You're paperwork. You're something I deal with when I got time. And right now," he checked his watch, "I got better things to do." He walked away. His footsteps faded. A door opened and closed somewhere, and she was alone again. The tears came then. Not loud, not dramatic. Just a quiet leaking she couldn't control, the body releasing pressure the mind couldn't hold. She didn't wipe them away. Let them track through the dried blood. Let them fall. Declan's voice in her memory. "Panic serves no one, Ollie. When everything goes wrong, you breathe. You observe. You wait for your moment." She breathed. She observed. And she waited. Still with me? Drop a comment below. Let me know where you think this story is headed. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. The shift changed at 10 p.m. She knew because the quality of noise altered. Different voices at the front desk. Different footfalls in the corridor. A brief burst of something that might have been laughter, muffled by distance and doors. New sergeant at the desk. She glimpsed him through the gap in the holding area door when another deputy passed through. Younger than the first. Nervous energy. The kind of person who might follow rules because following rules was easier than thinking. She stood, approached the bars, waited. He noticed her on his third pass through the corridor, stopped, looked at her with an expression that suggested he was trying to decide if acknowledging her existence was worth the effort. "Ma'am?" "I've been here since this morning. I haven't been allowed a phone call. I haven't seen a judge. I haven't received medical attention. I'd like to speak with whoever is in charge." The young deputy, his nameplate read Stanton, shifted his weight. "Booking sergeant's gone for the night. Sheriff's not in until morning." "Then I'll speak with you. You're an officer of the law. You have an obligation to ensure my rights are protected. Something flickered behind his eyes. Uncertainty. Conscience. The small internal voice that most people learn to silence in the name of job security. I'll check on your status. See about that phone call. He left. She waited. 15 minutes later, he returned with a different expression. Closed off now. Whatever conscience had flickered was gone. Sergeant Creech says your processing isn't complete. You'll see a judge in the morning for bail determination. That's more than 18 hours from my arrest. I don't make the rules, ma'am. Georgia law requires bail hearings within 48 hours, but extended detention without cause is a civil rights violation. I've been charged with trespassing my own property. There's no probable cause. There's no warrant. There's no legitimate reason for me to be in this cell. Stanton's jaw tightened. Like I said, morning. He left again. This time he didn't come back. The night stretched. She couldn't sleep. The bench was too hard, the cold too penetrating, the pain too present. So she sat. She breathed. She let her mind wander through the architecture of memory. Declan teaching her to read maps because you never know when you'll need to find your way home without help. Declan showing her how to check a room for exits because habit keeps you alive when thinking fails. Declan making her memorize a phone number, 11 digits, international format, nonsensical on the surface, because if anything ever goes truly wrong, Ollie, you call this number and you give them my name. She'd asked what the number connected to. He'd smiled his quiet smile, the one that said some questions had answers she wasn't cleared to hear. Friends, he'd said, the kind who don't forget their obligations. She hadn't called in 43 years of marriage, hadn't called in the 5 years since his death. The number lived in her bones the way hymns lived there, the way her wedding vows lived there, permanent, unshakable, always available. Maybe it was time. The morning came gray and reluctant, light seeping through the high window like it wasn't sure it wanted to illuminate this place. Hensley returned at 8 a.m., still in uniform, but the rumpled look suggested an early shift rather than a late night. Good news, Grandma, you get your phone call. Then you get to explain to a judge why you were trespassing. He unlocked the cell, led her down the corridor to the booking desk where a greasy phone hung from a wall bracket. Corded, ancient, the kind of phone that couldn't be traced by anything less than professional equipment. 2 minutes. Make it count. She picked up the receiver. The plastic was warm from someone else's hand, tacky with residue she didn't want to identify. Her fingers remembered the number before her mind did. Muscle memory. Declan's training. The connection clicked through servers she couldn't name, routing through switches in places she'd never been. International exchange, transfer protocol, a series of tones that suggested encryption, then a voice. Female. Crisp. British accent with an undertone of something mechanical. Identify. Opal Satterfield, widow of Sergeant Major Declan Satterfield. Authorization phrase, Drummond's promise. Behind her, Hensley snorted. Scrolling through his phone, not really listening. Just an old woman making her one call, probably to some nephew who'd have to scrape together bail money. The line quality changed. The static vanished. The silence that replaced it had weight, texture, significance. Mrs. Satterfield, male voice now, older, the kind of British that came from good schools and hard service. We've been waiting for this call. What do you need? The tears threatened again. She swallowed them. I need help. I'm in a jail cell in Georgia, a place called Sycamore Falls. They arrested me for gardening in my own yard. They hurt me. They won't let me see a judge. A pause. Not hesitation, processing. Location confirmed. Sycamore Falls Sheriff's Office. We have your position. Don't say another word to anyone. Don't sign anything. We're coming. Who is we? The people Declan trusted. The people who owed him everything. Mrs. Satterfield. The voice softened by half a degree. Ollie. He made us promise. We don't break promises. Not for him. Not for you. The line went dead. She hung up the phone. Turned to face Hensley, who was still scrolling, still dismissing her, still utterly unaware that the ground beneath his feet had begun to shift. "All done with your little call? Get anyone to care?" She met his eyes, felt something settle inside her. Not peace, exactly, but certainty. The certainty that she was no longer alone. "Yes," she said. "Someone cares." He laughed and grabbed her arm again. Same grip, same bruising pressure, and led her back to the cell. She didn't resist, didn't flinch, let him lock the door and walk away believing he'd won. The phone call had taken 90 seconds. The response would take less than 12 hours. The machinery was already moving. In a townhouse in Arlington, Virginia, a silver-haired man in his late 60s set down a secure phone and reached for a contact list that existed in no database, on no server, in no system that any government could subpoena. Niall Drummond had served 23 years in the Special Air Service. He'd trained with Declan Satterfield in the Brecon Beacons during the winter of 1979, when they'd both been young and stupid and convinced they were immortal. He'd stood beside Declan in Sierra Leone when the operation went sideways, and they'd had to improvise their way out of a jungle compound with nothing but knives and nerve. He'd delivered the eulogy at Declan's funeral 5 years ago, standing in a cemetery in Georgia while a flag was folded and presented to a woman who'd loved his best friend for nearly half a century. He'd made a promise that day. They all had. The phone calls went out within the hour. London, Boston, Washington. Men who'd served, who'd bled, who'd never forgotten what Declan had done for them in the dark places where official records didn't reach. By noon, 3 of them were on planes. By evening, they'd rendezvous in Atlanta. By morning, they'd be in Sycamore Falls. The sheriff's office had no idea what was coming, couldn't have imagined it. Didn't possess the frame of reference to understand that some debts transcended time and distance and the petty concerns of small-town politics. Declan Satterfield had saved lives, had kept secrets, had bled for people who could never publicly acknowledge his service. Now those people were going to repay the debt, and God help anyone who got in their way. The first sign that something had changed was the rental car. Black SUV, Virginia plates, tinted windows. It pulled into the sheriff's office parking lot at 9:47 a.m. and parked in the visitor spot closest to the entrance. 3 men emerged. They moved differently than civilians. Not aggressive, not threatening, just aware. Alert in a way that suggested they'd spent decades in environments where awareness meant survival. The oldest was silver-haired, ramrod posture, wearing a blue blazer over a white shirt with no tie. His face was weathered in the way of men who'd spent time in deserts and jungles, and the kind of cold that left scars invisible to the eye. The second was broad-shouldered, ruddy-faced, with a salt and pepper beard trimmed close. He wore a jacket that didn't quite conceal the outline of muscle beneath. The third was lean, dark-skinned, moving with the economy of someone trained to conserve energy for when it mattered. His eyes swept the parking lot, the building entrance, the patrol cars lined up in their designated spots. They entered the station together. Sergeant Creech looked up from his paperwork. Assessed, dismissed. 3 old guys in business casual, probably lawyers or insurance adjusters or some other brand of civilian nuisance. "Help you?" The silver-haired man approached the desk. His voice carried the particular authority of someone who expected to be obeyed, but never needed to raise his volume to achieve it. "We're here regarding Mrs. Opal Satterfield. She's been held in your facility since yesterday morning. We'd like to post bail and speak with your sheriff." Creech's eyes narrowed. "Bail hasn't been set. She hasn't seen a judge yet. It's been over 26 hours since her arrest. Georgia law requires bail determination within a reasonable time frame. The continued detention of a 74-year-old woman on charges of trespassing her own property is beginning to look less like procedure and more like civil rights violation." The words landed with precision. Creech's expression flickered. Not concern exactly, but the wariness of someone who'd recognized a threat he couldn't quite categorize. "And you are?" "Niall Drummond. These are my associates, Mr. McPherson and Dr. Blackwood. I'm acting as informal counsel for Mrs. Satterfield, pending the arrival of her attorney from Atlanta." "You a lawyer?" "I'm something more useful than a lawyer, Sergeant. I'm someone who knows when to call lawyers, and the lawyer I've contacted has already filed an emergency habeas corpus petition with the county court. He's also placed a courtesy call to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation regarding potential 14th Amendment violations, and he's left a message with the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division expressing concern about patterns of discriminatory enforcement in your jurisdiction. Creech's face went pale. Now. Drummond's voice remained perfectly level. I'd like to see Mrs. Satterfield, and I'd like to speak with whoever made the decision to hold her without charges for more than 24 hours. The door behind Creech opened. Sheriff Grady Polk emerged, coffee in hand, reading glasses perched on his forehead. He'd obviously heard the exchange through the thin walls of his office. Gentlemen, I'm Sheriff Polk. Why don't you step into my office and we can discuss this like civilized people? Drummond didn't move. I'll discuss things like a civilized person when Mrs. Satterfield is released, medically examined, and provided with a formal apology for the treatment she's received. Until then, I'll discuss things like what I am, which is someone who has friends in places that can make your life extremely uncomfortable. The silence stretched. Polk's coffee cup trembled slightly. Not fear, not yet, but the recognition that this conversation had moved outside the parameters of normal. What exactly are you threatening me with? Nothing. I don't threaten. I inform. And I'm informing you that the woman in your holding cell is not some vagrant you can mistreat without consequence. She's the widow of a decorated military officer with connections to intelligence services in 2 countries. Her situation has already been escalated to federal attention. The question isn't whether there will be an investigation. The question is how much that investigation will cost you personally. Polk set down his coffee. His expression hardened. I don't respond to intimidation. Neither do I. Drummond held his gaze. Which is why I'm not intimidating you. I'm simply telling you the truth. What you do with it is your choice. But I'd encourage you to make that choice quickly, because the lawyer's petition will be heard within the hour, and judges don't like being told that their county has been holding elderly women without due process. The standoff held for 3 heartbeats. 4. 5. Then Polk turned to Creech. Get the woman. Bring her to interview room 1. He looked back at Drummond. You want to see her? Fine. But you're not leaving with her until I understand what the hell is going on. Drummond nodded once. Acceptable. For now. They led Opal to the interview room in cuffs. Unnecessary. Punitive. A small cruelty designed to remind her, and the men waiting, who held official power in this building. She'd spent 31 hours in the cell, no food since yesterday's booking, no water except what came from the metal sink bolted to the wall, no medical attention for the cuts on her face, the bruises on her arm, the shoulder that had swelled overnight into something that throbbed with every heartbeat. But when the door opened and she saw Niall Drummond standing there, something cracked inside her. The armor she'd maintained through the arrest, the processing, the endless hours of cold and pain and silence, it fractured. Not broken, just relieved. Mrs. Satterfield. His voice was exactly as she remembered from the funeral. Steady, certain. The voice of a man who'd commanded soldiers in places where commands meant the difference between life and death. Niall. She couldn't manage more than his name. The tears came, and she let them, because after 31 hours of holding everything inside, there was no strength left for pretense. He crossed the room in 3 strides, took her cuffed hands in his. His own hands were warm, calloused, gentle in the way of men who understood how fragile the human body could be. We're here now, all of us. Declan made us promise, and we don't break promises. Behind him, the 2 other men moved into position. Not threatening, just present, filling the room with a kind of quiet authority that had nothing to do with badges or guns or official jurisdiction. My shoulder. Her voice came out thin, scraped. I think something's wrong. The lean man, Blackwood, she remembered, stepped forward. His eyes moved over her with the swift assessment of someone trained to evaluate injuries in combat conditions. Possible rotator cuff damage. Definitely soft tissue trauma. The swelling suggests more than 24 hours without ice or anti-inflammatories. His voice hardened by half a degree. Have you received any medical attention since your arrest? No. Blackwood turned to face Sheriff Polk, who stood in the doorway with an expression that suggested he was rapidly recalculating his position. I'm a trauma surgeon, Massachusetts General. I've testified in more malpractice cases than I can count, and I can tell you right now that denying medical care to a detained individual with visible injuries is the kind of decision that ends careers. Polk's jaw tightened. She didn't request medical attention. I requested it 3 times. Opal's voice found strength from somewhere. During booking, during processing, and again to the night deputy. I have names. I have times. I have witnesses. The lie was smooth, necessary, mostly true. She'd asked. They hadn't listened. The specifics were blurry, but the pattern was clear. Drummond released her hands and turned to face Polk. Sheriff, here's what's going to happen. Dr. Blackwood is going to examine Mrs. Satterfield. McPherson is going to document her injuries with photographs. I'm going to review every piece of paperwork associated with her arrest, including the body cam footage from the arresting officer. And then we're going to have a conversation about how this situation gets resolved. You don't have the authority. I have something better than authority. I have attention. Do you know how many journalists I've contacted in the last 12 hours? Do you know how many federal officials have been briefed on Mrs. Satterfield's situation? Do you know how many eyes are now watching what happens in this building? He paused. Let the silence do its work. You can fight me on this. You can insist on procedure and jurisdiction and all the small bureaucratic walls that protect people like you from accountability. But while you're fighting, the story's going to get out. Elderly widow arrested for gardening in her own yard. Held for 31 hours without charges. Denied medical care despite visible injuries. How do you think that story plays in Atlanta? In Washington? On the evening news? Polk's face had gone from pale to something approaching gray. I didn't authorize any of this. Hensley brought her in. Creech processed her. I wasn't even here yesterday. Then you won't mind demonstrating that by helping us get to the truth. The examination happened in the interview room, with Polk watching from the doorway and McPherson documenting everything on his phone. Blackwood's hands were gentle, but thorough. He checked her shoulder, likely strained, not torn, but imaging would be needed to confirm. Her wrists, where the cuffs had left raw red bands of damaged skin. Her face, where the fall had scraped cheek and chin and left a bruise blooming purple along her jaw. Her knee, which had swollen overnight into something that made walking difficult. This is consistent with forceful physical handling, Blackwood said, pitching his voice to Carrie. The wrist injuries suggest handcuffs applied too tightly and kept on too long. The facial abrasions suggest impact with a hard surface from a standing height. The shoulder damage is consistent with being lifted or dragged by the arm. He looked directly at Polk. None of this is consistent with fell during resisting arrest. Someone hurt this woman, deliberately. The silence in the room took on a different quality. Heavier. More dangerous. I want to see the body cam footage, Drummond said. Now. They set up a laptop in the conference room. Polk, increasingly cornered, agreed to play the footage rather than fight a legal battle he was beginning to realize he couldn't win. The video started at 8:52 a.m. Deputy Hensley approaching the property. The camera angle caught the garden, the morning light, the small figure of an elderly woman kneeling in the soil. Step away from the property, hands where I can see them. Now. Drummond watched without expression. McPherson took notes. Blackwood stood behind them both, arms crossed, face unreadable. The footage showed everything. Opal's confusion, her attempts to explain, Hensley's escalating aggression, the grab, the fall, the moment when she hit the ground and her glasses went flying. Stop resisting! She hadn't been resisting. The footage made that clear. Her body had twisted away from pain, the involuntary response of anyone suddenly grabbed and yanked off balance. Then the footage jumped. 8:54:17. Hensley grabbing her arm. 8:54:22. Static. Degraded image. 10 seconds of nothing. 8:54:33. Opal on the ground, blood on her face, glasses gone. What happened in those 10 seconds? Drummond's voice was quiet. Dangerously quiet. Polk shifted his weight. Equipment malfunction. These cameras, they're not perfect. Sometimes there's interference. Has this camera malfunctioned before? I'd have to check the maintenance logs. Then check them. Now. Creech was dispatched. He returned 10 minutes later with a printout that he clearly wished he hadn't found. Camera was serviced 2 weeks ago, Creech said, not meeting anyone's eyes. Full diagnostic. No issues reported. No malfunctions logged. Drummond took the printout, studied it, set it down with deliberate care. So the camera worked perfectly before this incident. It's worked perfectly after this incident, but during the exact 10 seconds when Deputy Hensley's actions are in question. Malfunction. Silence. How very convenient. The door opened. A young woman entered, professional dress, press badge visible on a lanyard around her neck. She was followed by an older man in a suit who carried a briefcase with the worn look of something that had seen the inside of many courtrooms. Sheriff Polk. The man extended his hand, though his expression suggested the gesture was formality rather than warmth. I'm Harrison Wells, representing Mrs. Satterfield. This is Yemi At.a.m, investigative reporter with the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. She's filed an open records request for all documentation related to Mrs. Satterfield's arrest, and she's here to observe the bail hearing, which my understanding is scheduled to begin in approximately, he checked his watch, 45 minutes. Polk's face completed its journey from gray to something approaching green. I wasn't informed of any press. Open proceedings are open to the press, Sheriff. That's how transparency works. The lawyer turned to Drummond. Mr. Drummond, good to see you. I reviewed the habeas petition on the flight down. I think we have several strong arguments for immediate release. The body cam footage has a 10-second gap during the moment of physical contact, Drummond said. Maintenance logs show no previous malfunction. Wells' expression sharpened. That's certainly going to be relevant to any civil action. He turned to Polk. Sheriff, I'm going to recommend to my client that she pursue all available legal remedies. But I'm also authorized to tell you that she's primarily interested in 2 things: her immediate release and a full investigation into Deputy Hensley's conduct. How this department responds in the next few hours will significantly influence how aggressively we pursue the civil side. The journalist, At.a.m, had been quietly taking notes throughout. Now she spoke, her voice carrying the particular neutrality of someone who'd learned to let facts speak for themselves. Sheriff Polk, I have a few questions for the record. First, how many excessive force complaints has Deputy Hensley received in his time with your department? Polk didn't answer. Second, how many of those complaints resulted in disciplinary action? Still nothing. Third, what is your department's policy on detention duration for nonviolent misdemeanors? The silence stretched. I'll note your non-response in my article, At.a.m said. Unless you'd prefer to provide a statement? This interview is over. Polk's voice had the quality of a man watching his career implode in slow motion. Mrs. Satterfield will be released pending the bail hearing. Any further questions can be directed to our public information officer. He left. The door didn't quite slam, but it closed with more force than necessary. Drummond allowed himself a small smile. Well, that's progress. They released her at 11:14 a.m. No charges filed. Pending investigation was the official language, which meant, we're not going to pursue this, but we're not going to admit we were wrong either. She walked out of the sheriff's office into sunshine that felt like absolution. The air smelled of magnolias and car exhaust and freedom. Her shoulder throbbed. Her knee complained with every step. Her wrist still bore the red marks of cuffs applied with cruelty. But she was out. Drummond walked beside her. McPherson and Blackwood flanked them, a protective formation that probably came from muscle memory rather than conscious choice. The rental SUV waited in the parking lot. Beside it stood Pastor Rollins, who'd driven down from the church the moment he'd heard she was being released. His face crumpled when he saw her. The bruises, the scrapes, the way she moved like something inside her had been damaged and hadn't yet begun to heal. Opal. Dear God. She let him embrace her. Let herself lean into the comfort of someone who'd known her for decades, who'd prayed with her and grieved with her and never once questioned whether she belonged. I'm all right, Clement. I'm all right. You're not all right. Look at you. I'm alive. I'm free. That's all right enough for now. Drummond waited until the embrace ended before speaking. "Mrs. Satterfield, Opal, we need to take you to a hospital. Get those injuries properly documented and treated. Then we need to talk about what comes next." "What comes next?" "The investigation, the civil suit, the press coverage." He paused. "And the question of why this happened in the first place." She looked at him, at the men who'd flown across the country because her husband had made them promise, at the pastor who'd driven down from his pulpit, at the journalist who was even now photographing the sheriff's office with the intent of making its failures public. "I was gardening," she said. "That's why this happened. I was gardening while black in a neighborhood where someone decided I didn't belong." Drummond nodded. "Yes, and that's exactly the story that's going to be told. Because people like Hensley, like Ashworth, like whoever made the decision to hold you without charges for 31 hours, they count on their victims being invisible. They count on the story never getting out. They count on the system protecting them the way it always has." He met her eyes. "But you're not invisible, Opal. Not anymore. And the system is about to learn that some people have friends who don't forget." They drove her to the hospital, documented everything. X-rays confirmed no fractures, but the soft tissue damage was extensive. She'd need physical therapy for the shoulder, rest for the knee, time for the bruises to fade and the scrapes to heal. But the evidence was preserved, time-stamped, photographed, entered into medical records that would become exhibits in whatever legal action followed. That evening, they gathered at her house. Drummond, McPherson, Blackwood, Pastor Rollins, the lawyer Wells. Opal sat in her favorite chair, the one by the window that looked out over the garden where this had all begun. Her begonias were still there, unwatered but alive, waiting for her to return. "The Atlanta Journal-Constitution story runs tomorrow," Wells said. "Ms. At.a.m has been thorough. She's documented the arrest, the detention, the lack of medical care, the body cam gap. She's also pulled Hensley's personnel file through a public records request, 3 prior excessive force complaints, all dismissed." "What about the charges?" "Dropped. Officially, insufficient evidence for prosecution. Unofficially, they know they can't win, and they don't want the exposure." Opal nodded. She'd expected as much. "And Hensley?" "Still employed. Desk duty pending internal review." Wells' voice carried the particular frustration of someone who'd spent decades watching the system protect its own. "The union has already provided representation. He'll probably receive a written reprimand, maybe a suspension. Termination is unlikely unless we apply significant pressure." "What kind of pressure?" Drummond leaned forward. "That depends on you, Opal. We can pursue this as far as you want to take it. Civil suit against the department, federal complaint, media campaign, all of it, or any of it. But you need to understand what that means. It means your life becoming public. It means people digging into your history, Declan's history, everything. It means years of legal battles with no guarantee of winning." She was quiet for a long moment, looking at the garden, at the photograph on the mantel, her and Declan on their wedding day, young and hopeful and unaware of everything that would come. "Declan never talked about his work," she said finally. "But he told me once, near the end, that the hardest thing wasn't the missions. It was watching people get away with cruelty because nobody had the courage to stop them." She met Drummond's eyes. "I have the courage. Do what needs to be done." The story ran the next morning. Elderly widow arrested for gardening in her own yard. It was picked up by the wire services before noon. CNN by evening. International coverage by the following day. The photograph that ran with every article showed Opal standing in her garden, bruised face visible, surrounded by the begonias she'd tended for 35 years. She hadn't posed for it. At.a.m had taken it without direction, capturing a moment of quiet defiance that resonated with everyone who'd ever been made to feel they didn't belong. The response was overwhelming. Donations to a legal defense fund that hadn't even been announced yet, letters of support from across the country, calls for investigation from civil rights organizations, elected officials, federal agencies. Sheriff Polk held a press conference the day after the story broke. He stood behind a podium with sweat visible on his forehead and read a statement about isolated incidents and thorough internal review and commitment to fair policing. Nobody believed him. The Department of Justice Civil Rights Division sent a letter the following week. they'd received multiple complaints regarding the Sycamore Falls Sheriff's Office. They were evaluating whether a formal investigation under 34 U.S.C. Section 12,601 was warranted. It was the beginning. Not the end, not yet, but the beginning of something that would unfold over months and years, through hearings and depositions and the slow grinding machinery of accountability. Opal watched it all from her garden. She'd started watering the begonias again the day after her release, started kneeling in the soil, started tending the blooms, started reclaiming the space that someone had tried to take from her. The neighbors watched, some with sympathy, some with something else, the particular discomfort of people who'd been comfortable with the old order and weren't sure what the new one would look like. Pamela Ashworth hadn't been seen in days. Her house was dark. Her car was gone. Rumor said she'd gone to stay with family in Savannah until things settled down. Things weren't going to settle down, not the way Pamela wanted. On the third evening after her release, Opal sat on her porch with a cup of Yorkshire Gold and watched the sun set over Magnolia Lane. The bruises were fading. The shoulder was improving. The garden was recovering. She thought about Declan, about the life they'd built together, the secrets they'd kept, the promises they'd made. She thought about the men who'd come when she called, men who'd served with her husband in places she'd never know, who'd bled for causes she'd never understand, who'd dropped everything and flown across the country because a promise made to a dead friend still meant something. She thought about what came next, the hearings, the testimony, the long, slow fight for accountability that might never fully succeed but had to be waged anyway. And she thought about the phone that sat inside on the kitchen counter, the one that had rung 3 times today, with calls from journalists, lawyers, federal investigators, the one that would keep ringing until this story played itself out, Drummond had told her before he'd left to return to Virginia. "This isn't over, Opal. This is going to take years. Are you prepared for that?" She'd said yes, meant it. Some fights were worth the years they took. Some injustices demanded answer, even when the answer came slow and incomplete and imperfect. Declan had taught her that. 48 years of marriage to a man who'd spent his life in the shadows, fighting battles nobody would ever know about. Now it was her turn. She sipped her tea and watched the light fade and waited for whatever came next. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Part 2 drops soon, and trust me, you don't want to miss what happens when Opal's husband's real story comes to light. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. City Council chambers. Public session. Every seat filled an hour before the proceedings began. Opal sat in the front row, wearing her Sunday best, navy blue dress, matching hat, the same outfit she'd worn to Declan's funeral. Beside her sat Drummond, straight-backed and silent. Behind them, McPherson and Blackwood. Behind them, Pastor Rollins and half his congregation. The press section overflowed. Yemi Adeyemo had reserved her seat days ago. She'd been joined by reporters from the AP, Reuters, the New York Times. 2 camera crews had set up in the back, their lights harsh against the wood-paneled walls. Sheriff Polk sat at the witness table, flanked by his attorney and a union representative. Deputy Hensley was notably absent. Medical leave, according to the official statement, though nobody believed that meant anything except hiding until this blows over. The council chair, Vera Tilson, 64, former school teacher, 3 terms on the council, called the session to order. This is a public hearing regarding recent complaints against the Sycamore Falls Sheriff's Office. We'll begin with a summary of the incidents in question, followed by testimony from involved parties. Sheriff Polk, you'll have an opportunity to respond. Members of the public have also signed up to speak, and we'll hear from them in order of registration. The summary took 20 minutes. Dry, clinical. The language of bureaucracy covering the raw reality of what had happened. Then came the testimony. The lawyer, Wells, presented the evidence first. Body cam footage, played on a screen that everyone could see. The 10-second gap, highlighted and noted. Medical records showing Opal's injuries. The maintenance log, proving the camera had been functioning before and after. Hensley's personnel file with its pattern of complaints and lack of consequences. Sheriff Polk's attorney objected frequently. Irrelevant. Hearsay. Beyond the scope. Most of the objections were overruled. Then Drummond stood. He walked to the podium with the unhurried gait of a man who had addressed far more hostile audiences than a small-town city council. He carried a single folder. Inside was a document that had taken 3 weeks of phone calls, favors, and formal requests to obtain. Madam Chair, members of the Council, my name is Niall Drummond. I'm a retired warrant officer of the British Army, and I served for 23 years in the Special Air Service. I'm here today not as a lawyer or an advocate, but as a witness to the character of the woman who was brutalized by your officers and to the man she was married to for 48 years. He opened the folder. I have here a document recently declassified at my formal request by the British Ministry of Defence. It is a citation for military valor, the details of which were previously classified for reasons of national security. I'd like to read it into the record. He cleared his throat. Citation for Sergeant Major Declan James Satterfield, 22nd Special Air Service Regiment, for extraordinary valor during Operation Barras, Sierra Leone, September 2000. He looked up from the document, making sure he had everyone's attention. Sergeant Major Satterfield led a 6-man extraction team through hostile jungle terrain to rescue British hostages held by rebel forces. Under sustained enemy fire, with 3 members of his team wounded and communications severed, Sergeant Major Satterfield personally eliminated 12 enemy combatants and carried 2 wounded hostages to the extraction point. He sustained injuries to his shoulder, abdomen, and left leg during the operation, but refused evacuation until all hostages were secured. The silence in the chamber was complete. For his actions, Sergeant Major Satterfield was awarded the Conspicuous Gallantry Cross, the second highest decoration for bravery in the United Kingdom. He served his country for 31 years. He died in 2019, at home, beside his wife of 48 years. Drummond closed the folder. Mrs. Opal Satterfield is not a vagrant. She is not a trespasser. She is not a suspicious individual who needed to be investigated because a neighbor didn't recognize her. She is the widow of one of the most decorated soldiers in British Special Forces history, a man who bled for his country, a man who saved lives at the cost of his own health, a man who chose to spend his retirement years in a quiet house on Magnolia Lane, tending a garden with the woman he loved. He turned to face Sheriff Polk directly. That woman was thrown to the ground by your deputy. She was handcuffed and detained for 31 hours without charges. She was denied medical attention for injuries your deputy caused. She was treated like a criminal for the offense of gardening while black. His voice dropped. I have contacts at the Department of Justice, at the FBI Civil Rights Division, at the British Embassy in Washington. All of them are now aware of what happened in Sycamore Falls. All of them are watching what you do next. He looked at the council. The question before this body is not whether injustice occurred. The evidence is clear. The question is whether this community has the courage to acknowledge that injustice and take meaningful action to prevent it from happening again. He returned to his seat beside Opal. The silence held for a long moment. Then Vera Tilson spoke. Thank you, Mr. Drummond. Sheriff Polk, you may respond. Polk's attorney whispered urgently in his ear. Polk shook his head, stood, faced the room with the expression of a man who knew he'd already lost, but hadn't yet decided how much he was willing to concede. This was an unfortunate incident. Deputy Hensley responded to a legitimate call from a concerned citizen. He followed procedure as he understood it. The injuries Mrs. Satterfield sustained were accidental. There was no intent to harm. His voice carried no conviction. That said, he paused, swallowed. The department takes these allegations seriously. We will conduct a thorough internal review. We will implement additional training regarding de-escalation and community relations. And we will cooperate fully with any state or federal investigation. It wasn't enough. Everyone knew it wasn't enough. But it was an admission, a crack in the wall. The rest of the hearing unfolded according to its own procedural logic. Public comments, motions, votes. By the end of the evening, the council had unanimously approved a resolution requesting an independent investigation of the sheriff's office and calling for immediate policy reforms regarding detention procedures and use of force. It wasn't justice. Not yet. Not fully, but it was progress. Opal walked out of the chambers into the warm Georgia night. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. She paused at the top of the steps, looking out over the crowd that had gathered. Supporters, skeptics, curious onlookers. Drummond stood beside her. "How do you feel?" She considered the question. "Tired," she said finally, "and hopeful, and angry, all at the same time." "That's about right." "What happens now?" "Now the real work begins. DOJ investigation, civil suit, media pressure. It's going to take years, Opal. There will be setbacks. There will be moments when it feels like nothing is changing. But something is changing. Tonight proved that." She nodded. Declan would have hated all this attention. He would have, but he'd have understood why it was necessary. They walked down the steps together, past the cameras, past the crowd, toward the car that would take her home to Magnolia Lane. To her garden. To the begonias that were still blooming, still waiting, still marking the space she'd earned through decades of presence. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. But for the first time since that terrible morning 3 weeks ago, Opal Satterfield felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The morning after the council hearing, Opal woke to find 17 news vans parked on Magnolia Lane. She watched them from her kitchen window while the kettle heated. Reporters clustered in small groups, drinking coffee from paper cups, checking phones, waiting for something to happen. 2 of them had set up lawn chairs on the sidewalk across from her house, which technically violated no ordinance but felt like violation nonetheless. The phone rang. It had been ringing since 6 a.m., journalists, lawyers, strangers who'd found her number and wanted to express support or outrage or curiosity. She'd stopped answering after the 3rd call. The kettle whistled. She poured her tea. Yorkshire Gold, loose leaf, the way Declan had taught her. Some rituals you didn't abandon just because the world had turned upside down. A knock at the back door. She tensed, then relaxed when she saw Niall Drummond's face through the glass. He'd come around through the neighbor's yard, avoiding the press gauntlet at the front. "May I?" She unlocked the door. Let him in. He moved through her kitchen with the particular awareness of someone who'd spent decades entering unfamiliar spaces and checking them for threats. "You've seen the news?" "I've seen the vans. The story's gone international. BBC picked it up last night. So did Al Jazeera, Deutsche Welle, and about 40 other outlets I've never heard of." He accepted the cup of tea she offered, nodded his thanks. "You're famous, Opal, whether you wanted to be or not." She sat at the small table by the window, the same table where she'd sat with Declan for 48 years of breakfasts, dinners, quiet evenings reading in companionable silence. "What do I do now?" "That depends on what you want." Wells has 3 interview requests from national networks. There's a documentary producer who wants to tell your story. A publisher reached out about a book deal. He paused. "You don't have to do any of it. You can go back to your garden and let the lawyers handle everything. Nobody would blame you." She considered this. The steam from her tea curled upward, catching the morning light. Declan used to say that silence was a weapon, that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was refuse to speak. He was right, in certain contexts. But he also said there were times when silence was complicity, when staying quiet meant letting the people who hurt you define the narrative. She met Drummond's eyes. "I don't want to be silent. I want people to understand what happened. Not just to me, to everyone like me who's been made to feel like a stranger in their own home." Drummond nodded. "Then we'll make sure they understand." The first interview aired 3 days later. National morning show, live from her living room, cameras and lights, and a host whose face Opal had seen on television for 20 years without ever expecting to speak to in person. They'd discussed the questions in advance. Nothing about Declan's classified work, nothing about the SAS Brotherhood or how they'd mobilized, just the story of an elderly woman arrested for gardening, held without charges, denied medical care. It was enough. "Mrs. Satterfield, you've lived in this house for 35 years. You've been part of this community for decades. How did it feel to be treated like a criminal in your own yard? She took a breath, spoke the words she'd rehearsed with Wells the night before, but they came out raw anyway, carrying weight she hadn't anticipated. It felt like everything I'd built didn't matter, like 48 years of marriage, 40 years of nursing, 35 years of paying taxes and voting and volunteering. None of it counted. I was just a black woman in a white neighborhood. That's all they saw. The host leaned forward, professionally sympathetic, genuinely interested. The body cam footage shows a 10-second gap during the moment of physical contact. The sheriff's office claims equipment malfunction, but maintenance records show no prior issues. What do you think happened during those 10 seconds? I know what happened. I was there. Deputy Hensley grabbed my arm and threw me to the ground. I hit my face on the brick edging. My glasses broke. I tasted blood. Then he handcuffed me and told me to stop resisting, even though I hadn't resisted anything. And you believe the footage was deliberately altered? I believe that 10 seconds of truth disappeared, and the people who control that footage haven't explained why. The interview ran for 12 minutes. By noon, clips were circulating on every social media platform. By evening, Justice for Opal was trending nationally. The Department of Justice letter arrived the following week. Wells brought it to her house personally, his expression carrying the particular satisfaction of a lawyer who'd spent his career fighting uphill battles and had finally caught a favorable wind. Pattern or practice investigation, he said, setting the document on her kitchen table. They're looking at the entire sheriff's office, not just your case. 15 years of complaints, dozens of potential civil rights violations. This is exactly what we hoped for. Opal read the letter slowly. Legal language, formal phrasing, the careful bureaucratic prose of federal government. But beneath the formality was something she recognized. Power shifting. What happens now? Federal investigators arrive within 30 days. They'll review policies, procedures, training records, complaint files. They'll interview officers, victims, witnesses. If they find a pattern of violations, and based on what we've seen they will, they'll negotiate a consent decree with the county, mandatory reforms, federal oversight, real accountability. How long does that take? Years. Probably 18 months to 2 years before the consent decree is finalized. Then 3 to 5 years of federal monitoring. She absorbed this. The timeline of justice measured not in days or weeks, but in years. The slow grinding of institutions against each other, wearing down resistance through sustained pressure rather than dramatic confrontation. And Hensley? What happens to him? Wells' expression flickered. The satisfaction dimmed. That's more complicated. He resigned last week, left the department before the internal investigation could conclude. Technically, he's no longer employed by the county, which limits our options for administrative discipline. So he just walks away? Not exactly. The Georgia Peace Officer Standards and Training Council can revoke his certification, which would prevent him from working as a police officer anywhere in the state. We've filed a complaint. They'll review it over the next 6 months. 6 months. Bureaucracy moves slowly, Opal. Always has. The important thing is that the complaint is filed, the evidence is documented, and his career in law enforcement is effectively over, even if the formal process takes time. She looked at the letter again, at the seal of the Department of Justice, at the signature of an assistant attorney general whose name she didn't recognize, but whose authority she understood. It's not enough, she said quietly. It's never enough. No. Wells' voice was gentle. It never is, but it's something, and sometimes something is all we get. If you're still watching, hit that subscribe button. We're about to see just how far this investigation goes. The federal investigators arrived in Sycamore Falls on a Tuesday morning in October. 3 of them, 2 women, 1 man. Suits and credentials, and the particular manner of people who'd spent their careers holding powerful institutions accountable. They set up in a conference room at the county courthouse, neutral ground, away from the sheriff's office they'd come to examine. For the next 6 weeks, they would review every document, interview every witness, trace every complaint that had been filed and dismissed and buried over the past 15 years. Opal wasn't required to participate. Her testimony had already been given, her evidence already submitted. But she followed the investigation through Wells's updates, through Yemi Adeyemo's reporting, through the slow accumulation of revelations that emerged as the federal team dug deeper. Deputy Hensley's personnel file contained more than 3 complaints. There were 7. 5 involving excessive force. 2 involving racial slurs documented by fellow officers who'd chosen not to formally report. All 7 had been dismissed by Internal Affairs without meaningful investigation. The body cam footage gap wasn't an isolated incident. Similar gaps appeared in footage from at least 4 other arrests over the past 3 years. All 4 involved black suspects. All 4 resulted in dropped charges or dismissed complaints. Sheriff Polk's leadership had created a culture of impunity. Officers knew their misconduct wouldn't be investigated seriously. Victims knew their complaints wouldn't be heard. The system had optimized itself for silence, and silence had become the norm. The federal investigators documented everything, built a case not against individual officers, but against the institution itself. The pattern they uncovered stretched back more than a decade, through 3 sheriffs, through dozens of officers, through hundreds of incidents that had never been properly addressed. By December, the preliminary findings were complete. Systemic deficiencies in training, supervision, and accountability, Wells read from the DOJ summary document. Patterns of discriminatory enforcement consistent with constitutional violations. Inadequate investigation of civilian complaints. Failure to maintain accurate records of uses of force. He looked up at Opal, who sat across from him in her living room with a cup of tea cooling in her hands. They're recommending a consent decree, mandatory reforms across the board. Federal monitor appointed for 3 years minimum. This is as strong a finding as we could have hoped for. What reforms? Body camera policy overhaul. Cameras must remain on during all civilian interactions. Footage must be preserved for minimum 2 years. Any gaps or malfunctions must be investigated by external auditor. Bias training for all officers, updated annually. Civilian Oversight Board with real authority to review complaints. Quarterly reporting on traffic stops, arrests, and uses of force, broken down by demographics. Independent review of all excessive force complaints. She absorbed the list. Comprehensive, meaningful, the kind of changes that could actually make a difference if implemented and enforced. And if they don't comply? The federal monitor reports directly to the court. Non-compliance can result in contempt findings, additional penalties, even direct federal intervention. The county has strong incentive to cooperate. What about Polk? He announced his retirement last week, effective January 1st. He's not facing criminal charges. The evidence isn't strong enough to prove individual intent, but his career is over. He'll leave with his pension, but he'll leave with his reputation in ruins. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. But it was something. 3 weeks before the consent decree was scheduled for signing, Yemi Adeyemo called with news that changed everything. "I found something," she said, her voice carrying the particular intensity of a journalist who'd uncovered more than she'd expected. During the discovery process, the county was required to turn over all communications related to your case. Most of it was routine, emails about scheduling, memos about procedure, but there was one email that was almost entirely redacted. Black boxes over everything except the date, the sender line, and the subject. Opal felt something tighten in her chest. What did it say? The subject line was R.E. the Satterfield problem. Sender was marked as confidential. Recipient was Sheriff Polk. The date was 2 days after your arrest. The Satterfield problem. Yes. I filed a motion to compel disclosure of the unredacted version. The county is fighting it, claiming law enforcement privilege. But here's the thing. The privilege shouldn't apply if the communication was about covering up misconduct rather than legitimate police work. What do you think it says? I don't know. But someone, 2 days after your arrest, was emailing the sheriff about you specifically, calling you a problem. That suggests coordination. That suggests someone higher up knew what was happening and was involved in managing it. The phone felt heavy in Opal's hand. Who would have sent that email? That's what I'm trying to find out. The discovery materials included a metadata log showing the email originated from a county government server, not the sheriff's office, the main county administrative network. Someone in county government was communicating with Polk about your case. Someone like who? County commissioner, city manager, maybe even the mayor's office. At.a.m paused. Or the HOA president who filed the original complaint. Pamela Ashworth has connections throughout local government. Her ex-husband used to be on the county commission. The name landed like a stone dropped in still water. Pamela Ashworth sent that email? I can't prove it, not yet. But the timing fits. 2 days after your arrest, she would have known things weren't going the way she expected. You'd made your phone call. The men had arrived. The press was starting to pay attention. If she had connections in county government, she might have reached out to manage the situation. Opal thought about her neighbor. The woman who'd called the police because she'd seen a black woman gardening. The woman who'd filed HOA citations about flower colors. The woman who'd watched from her window while Opal was thrown to the ground and handcuffed. Can you find out? I'm working on it. The motion to compel will take weeks to resolve, but I have other sources. People inside the county government who are unhappy with how this has been handled. People who might be willing to talk. Be careful. If she has connections. I know. At.a.m's voice carried the confidence of someone who'd spent years investigating people who didn't want to be investigated. I've dealt with worse. The question is whether you want me to pursue this. If that email proves coordination between Ashworth and county officials, it changes the scope of the case. It's no longer just about one deputy's misconduct. It's about a conspiracy to violate your civil rights. Opal looked out her window at the house 3 doors down. Pamela Ashworth's house, still dark, still empty. The woman had been gone for months now, hiding in Savannah while the storm she'd triggered raged on without her. Pursue it, Opal said. I want to know the truth. The consent decree was signed in January, a federal courtroom in Atlanta. Cameras allowed for the first time in the district's history, a concession to the public interest in the case. Opal sat in the front row, flanked by Drummond and Pastor Rollins, watching as the county attorney and the DOJ representative affixed their signatures to a document that would reshape law enforcement in Sycamore Falls for at least the next 3 years. The terms were everything Wells had promised: body cameras, bias training, civilian oversight, demographic reporting, external audits, a federal monitor with authority to access any document, interview any officer, require any reform deemed necessary for constitutional compliance. Judge Margaret Chen delivered brief remarks before finalizing the agreement. This consent decree represents an acknowledgement by Sycamore Falls County that systemic failures in its sheriff's office led to constitutional violations affecting the civil rights of its residents. It is not an admission of guilt by any individual. It is not a punishment for past misconduct. It is a commitment to future compliance with the basic principles of equal protection under the law. She looked directly at Opal. Mrs. Satterfield, what happened to you should never have happened. No American should be arrested for gardening in their own yard. No American should be held without charges, denied medical care, treated as a criminal for the color of their skin. The failures that led to your experience were not isolated. They were systemic, and this decree is intended to ensure that no one else in this county suffers as you did. Opal didn't speak, didn't need to. The acknowledgement was enough, the simple recognition that she hadn't imagined it, hadn't exaggerated it, hadn't made it up. The system had failed her. Now the system was being forced to change. After the signing, Drummond walked with her to the courthouse steps. The press was waiting, always waiting now, documenting every development in a story that had grown far beyond one woman's arrest. How do you feel? The question came from a dozen voices at once. She paused, gathered her thoughts, spoke clearly enough for the microphones to catch every word. I feel grateful. Grateful for the people who believed me when the system said I was lying. Grateful for the investigators who found the truth when the county wanted to bury it. Grateful for everyone who raised their voices and demanded accountability. She paused. But I also feel the weight of everyone who came before me. The people who were arrested and abused and never got justice. The people who filed complaints that were ignored. The people who stopped speaking up because they learned that speaking up didn't matter. This consent decree is for them too. Every name in those files. Every complaint that was dismissed. Every victim who never got their day in court. She looked directly into the nearest camera. The fight isn't over. Signing a document doesn't change a culture. It takes years of work, years of monitoring, years of pressure to turn promises into practice. But today is a beginning, and sometimes a beginning is enough. 2 months later, At.a.m published her follow-up investigation, The Satterfield Conspiracy, How Local Officials Coordinated to Suppress a Civil Rights Case. The story revealed what the redacted email had concealed. Pamela Ashworth had indeed contacted county officials 2 days after Opal's arrest. Not through official channels, through personal connections. Her ex-husband's former colleague on the county commission had reached out to Sheriff Polk with a simple message: handle this quietly. The email chain, obtained through anonymous source and later confirmed through legal discovery, showed a pattern of coordination. Ashworth had provided the initial complaint. A county commissioner had pressured Polk to resolve the situation without publicity. Polk had instructed his deputies to expedite processing, a euphemism, the investigation revealed, for denying phone calls and delaying bail hearings until the situation could be managed. The conspiracy had unraveled when Opal made her phone call. The arrival of the SAS Brotherhood, the involvement of an Atlanta attorney, the sudden media attention, none of it had been anticipated. The county officials had expected a quiet resolution. Instead, they'd gotten a national scandal. The fallout was immediate. The county commissioner resigned within a week of the story's publication, citing personal reasons that fooled no one. 2 other officials who'd been copied on the email chain faced ethics investigations. Pamela Ashworth, finally tracked down by reporters in Savannah, declined to comment. But her silence spoke volumes. Criminal charges were considered but ultimately not filed. The evidence showed coordination, but not the kind of specific intent required for federal civil rights prosecution. The officials had wanted the situation to go away quietly. They hadn't explicitly ordered anyone to harm Opal. The line between conspiracy and negligence was blurry enough that prosecutors declined to pursue it. Wells explained the decision during one of their now regular meetings. It's frustrating, I know. They orchestrated a cover-up, and they are not going to prison for it. But the political consequences are real. Careers ended, reputations destroyed. The next time someone in county government thinks about pressuring law enforcement to suppress a civil rights complaint, they'll remember what happened here. And Ashworth? She sold her house, moved to Florida. Her name is permanently attached to this case. Every time someone searches for her online, they'll find stories about the woman who called the police on her elderly neighbor for gardening. It wasn't justice, not the kind Opal had imagined, but it was consequence. And sometimes consequence was all the system could deliver. Drop a comment below. Do you think Opal got the justice she deserved? And make sure you're subscribed for more stories like this one. Spring came slowly to Magnolia Lane. Opal marked the passing days by the progress of her garden. February brought the first green shoots pushing through winter-hardened soil. March brought buds on the azalea bushes Declan had planted in 1993. April brought the begonias back to full bloom, crimson against dark earth, proof that some things endured despite everything. The federal monitor had been in place for 3 months now. A former police chief from Ohio named Dorothy Hamlin, who'd spent her career reforming departments and had the scars to prove it. She visited the sheriff's office weekly, reviewed every use of force report, interviewed officers about their training and procedures. Her first quarterly report documented significant progress in some areas and continued resistance in others. The new sheriff, elected in a special election after Polk's retirement, had campaigned on reform. Young, black, former state trooper named Marcus Webb. He'd reached out to Opal personally during his campaign, asked for her endorsement, received it. She'd stood beside him at his inauguration, symbol of everything his administration promised to change. Whether the promises would become reality remained to be seen. The civil suit was still pending. Wells had filed against the county, the sheriff's office, Deputy Hensley individually, and, after At.a.m.'s investigation, Pamela Ashworth and the county officials who'd coordinated the cover-up. The case would take years to resolve. Depositions, discovery, motions, counter-motions, the slow grinding of civil litigation against defendants with resources and motivation to delay. Opal had stopped tracking the details. Wells sent her updates monthly, and she read them, but the legal maneuvering had become background noise. The system would do what the system did. Her job now was to live. Drummond had returned to Virginia after the consent decree signing, but they spoke weekly. Phone calls that started with case updates and drifted into longer conversations about memory and loss, and the strange business of growing old in a world that changed faster than anyone could follow. "Declan talked about you," she told him one April evening. When things were bad, when the pain got worse than he wanted to admit, he'd tell me stories about the missions, not the details, never the details, but about the men, about you. What did he say? That you were the one who taught him patience, that when everyone else wanted to charge ahead, you were the one who said, wait, observe, understand the situation before you act. Drummond was quiet for a moment. He taught me more than I taught him, about courage, about commitment, about keeping promises, even when keeping them costs you everything. He kept his promise to me, 48 years. And we kept our promise to him. That's how it works, Opal. The chain of obligation. The debts we owe each other that can't be measured in money or time. Declan gave everything he had to the people he served with. We owed him this. We owed you this. She wiped her eyes. Wiped. Didn't apologize for the tears. Thank you, Niall, for everything. Don't thank me. Thank him. He's the one who made sure you'd never be alone. The photograph was the one thing she'd never explained to anyone. It sat on the mantel in a silver frame, partially hidden behind a vase of silk flowers that Declan had bought for their 30th anniversary. She'd never moved it, never drawn attention to it, never answered the questions it might have raised. Declan in desert camouflage, arm around a young soldier whose face was half turned from the camera. The young soldier was grinning. Declan was not. Yemi At.a.m noticed it during one of her visits. The journalist had become something like a friend over the past months. Someone who understood the story well enough to know which questions to ask and which to leave unasked. Who is that? Opal hesitated, then decided. Some secrets had expiration dates. That's Prince Harry, Afghanistan, 2008. Declan was part of an unofficial protection detail during one of the prince's deployments. At.a.m's eyes widened. Prince Harry? As in fifth in line to the British throne at the time. Third now, I suppose. Declan never talked about it, said the operation was classified, said he'd signed documents that would outlive him, but he kept the photograph. Did Harry know your husband? They spent 3 weeks together in Helmand Province. Whatever happened during those weeks, Declan never said, but when he died, someone sent flowers to the funeral. White roses, anonymous. No card, no name. Just white roses from a florist in London that I'd never heard of. She looked at the photograph. I always wondered, never asked. Some questions don't need answers. At.a.m was quiet for a long moment. Would you be willing to share this? For the story? No. Opal's voice was gentle but firm. That part of his life wasn't mine to share. He kept it private for a reason. I'll honor that. The journalist nodded, didn't press. Some boundaries were sacred, even for stories that had already revealed so much. The civil suit settled in June. Wells delivered the news in person, sitting at her kitchen table with documents spread between their teacups. The county agreed to $275,000. Ashworth's insurance carrier added another $50,000. The individual defendants, Hensley and the county officials, contributed nothing, but they've agreed to formal statements of responsibility that will be part of the public record. Statements of responsibility? Not admissions of guilt. The legal distinction matters for liability purposes, but they acknowledge that their actions contributed to the violation of your civil rights. Their names will be attached to those statements forever. Opal looked at the settlement documents. The numbers meant nothing to her. She didn't need money. The house was paid off. Her pension was sufficient. Her needs were simple. I want to do something with it, something that matters. What did you have in mind? A scholarship for nursing students, young people from backgrounds like mine who want to help others heal. She paused. And a memorial garden in the community center downtown, a place where anyone can sit and rest and remember that they belong here. Wells smiled. I can help you set that up. Tax-advantaged charitable trust. The scholarship can run for decades if we structure it right. The Declan and Opal Satterfield Memorial Fund. She tested the words. For young people who want to make a difference. I think he'd approve. I think he would too. Summer settled over Sycamore Falls with the heavy heat that Georgians learned to endure rather than enjoy. Opal spent her mornings in the garden, her afternoons in the air-conditioned cool of her living room, her evenings on the porch watching fireflies blink their cold lights across the lawn. The news vans were long gone. The reporters had moved on to other stories. The consent decree monitoring continued in the background, documented in quarterly reports that drew less attention each time. The world had developed the short memory that made sustained change so difficult. But change was happening. Slowly. Imperfectly. In ways that wouldn't make headlines, but would matter to the people affected. The new sheriff had implemented every required reform on schedule. Body cameras recorded every interaction. Civilian complaints were investigated by an independent board. Training sessions on bias and de-escalation happened monthly. The demographic data showed incremental improvements: fewer stops, fewer arrests, fewer uses of force against black residents. It wasn't transformation, it was evolution. The kind of progress measured in percentage points and procedural adjustments rather than dramatic revelations. Opal accepted this, had learned to accept it over the course of a year that had taught her more about systems and institutions than 74 previous years combined. Justice wasn't a destination, it was a direction. You moved toward it, step by step, knowing you'd never arrive but committed to the journey anyway. The letter arrived in August. She found it in Declan's desk drawer, tucked behind folders of tax documents and bank statements she'd never gotten around to organizing. An envelope, yellowed with age, her name written in his handwriting. Ollie. Just her name. No date. No return address. Just the envelope and the certainty, immediate and instinctive, that he'd written this for a moment he'd known would come, but hadn't wanted to define. She held it for a long time, traced the letters of her name with her finger, felt the weight of paper that had waited years, decades maybe, to be found. She didn't open it. Not yet. Some letters were meant to be read when you were ready, and she wasn't ready. Not yet. The fall came early that year. September brought cool mornings and the first hints of changing leaves. The begonias faded, the azaleas began their dormant retreat. The garden settled into the patient waiting that preceded winter. Opal found herself thinking more about time, about how much of it she'd had, how much remained, how little any of them really knew about either. She was 75 now. Her birthday had passed in July, marked by a small gathering of friends, Pastor Rollins, Delphine Coates, the new neighbors who'd moved in across the street. Drummond had sent flowers from Virginia, white roses, the same kind she'd received at Declan's funeral from an anonymous sender. The Federal Monitor's latest report noted substantial compliance with consent decree requirements. 2 years remained on the monitoring period. After that, the sheriff's office would be on its own, reformed, theoretically, but untested by the pressures that had corrupted it in the first place. Would the changes last? No one could say. Systems had inertia. Cultures resisted transformation. The forces that had produced Bradley Hensley and Grady Polk and the casual cruelty of that June morning hadn't been eliminated, just suppressed, managed, pushed below the surface. But the surface mattered too. The daily interactions between officers and citizens, the complaints that were now investigated rather than dismissed, the data that was now collected and reported and scrutinized. These things changed behavior, even if they couldn't change hearts. Progress was fragile. But it was real. On the anniversary of her arrest, Opal woke before dawn and walked to her garden. The begonias were gone for the season, but the beds were maintained, the soil turned and mulched against the coming cold. She knelt in the dirt, carefully now, mindful of her knee, and let her hands rest in the earth where so much had started and so much had changed. 1 year ago, she'd been kneeling in this same spot when a young deputy had decided she didn't belong. Had grabbed her arm, thrown her to the ground, handcuffed her, hauled her off to a cell where she'd spent 31 hours wondering if anyone would come. Someone had come. Multiple someones. People she'd known and people she hadn't. People who'd made promises to a man she'd loved, and people who'd been moved by a story they'd seen on the news. The system had failed her, and then the system had been forced to respond to its own failure. Not perfectly, not completely, but meaningfully. in ways that would affect people she'd never meet, prevent harm she'd never know about, shift the balance of power in small ways that accumulated over time. Was it enough? No, it was never enough. But it was something, and sometimes something was all you could ask for. She stood, brushed the dirt from her knees, walked back inside as the sun crested the trees and spilled golden light across Magnolia Lane. The letter was still in the drawer, still waiting. Maybe today. She made her tea first. Yorkshire gold, loose leaf, the ritual unchanged after all these years. Carried it to the small table by the window and sat in the chair where she'd sat 10,000 times before. Then she retrieved the envelope. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Age, partly. Emotion, mostly. The paper inside was cream-colored, heavy stock, the kind Declan had always preferred for important correspondence. His handwriting filled 2 pages, small, precise, the script of a man who'd been trained to communicate efficiently and had never lost the habit. Ollie, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you found the drawer where I hide the things I don't want to think about. I always knew you'd clean it out eventually. You're better at organization than I ever was. I've written this letter a dozen times over the years. Each time, I throw it away and start over because the words never seem right. How do you tell someone what they've meant to you when the meaning is larger than language? You saved me. Not the way the men I served with saved me, pulling me from wreckage, covering my advance, taking bullets that might have had my name on them. You saved me in a different way. By being the place I could return to. By being the person I could become when I wasn't the man the missions required me to be. I did things in my service that I've never told you about. Things that needed doing, that I don't regret, but that live in me like shrapnel too deep to remove. You never asked, never pushed, just loved me, whole and complete, including the parts I couldn't show you. That kind of love is rare. I knew it when I found it. I never forgot how lucky I was to have it. The men I served with, Niall, Mac, Terry, the others, they made me promise to watch over them, and I made them promise the same. If anything ever goes wrong, they'll come. That's how it works with us. The debts we owe each other outlast everything else. I hope you never have to call them. I hope your life is peaceful and quiet and full of gardens and tea and all the ordinary things that I came home to you for. But if you do have to call, if something happens that requires more than you can handle alone, they'll be there. Trust them. They're the brothers I chose, and they'll protect you the way they'd protect me. I wish I could tell you all of it. The missions, the places, the names and faces that populate my dreams when the nights get long. But some stories don't belong to me alone. They belong to the service, to the crown, to the debts I owe that can only be paid in silence. What I can tell you is this. Every time I came home, you made the homecoming worth it. Every time I left, you gave me something to return to. Every day we had together, 48 years of them, which sounds like a long time until you realize it wasn't nearly enough. Every day was a gift I never took for granted. I love you, present tense, even though I'm writing this from a past that will have ended by the time you read it. Some things don't change just because the person who feels them is no longer there to feel them. Take care of the garden. Take care of yourself. And remember that you're never alone. Not really, because love like ours doesn't end. It just changes form. Yours, always, Declan. She read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it carefully, returned it to its envelope, and placed it in the drawer beside her bed, where she could reach it in the dark, when the nights got long and the memories crowded close, and she needed to remember that she'd been loved by someone extraordinary. The tears came, but they weren't only grief. They were gratitude and love, and the strange, bittersweet certainty that some people leave marks on the world that time can't erase. The phone call came on an October evening. She was sitting on her porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and rose, when the phone buzzed in her pocket. Unknown number, British area code. She answered, expecting a journalist. One of the international outlets still ran occasional follow-up stories. Mrs. Satterfield? The voice was male. British accent, younger than she'd expected, 30s maybe, but carrying an authority that suggested someone accustomed to being listened to. "This is she. I hope I'm not disturbing you. I saw the news, what happened to you and how it all resolved, and I wanted to reach out. Make sure you're all right. I'm sorry, who is this?" A pause, then something that might have been a laugh, quiet and rueful. "Just someone who remembers your husband. He did a kindness for me once, a long time ago, in a place very far from here. I never forgot it." Something stirred in her memory. The photograph on the mantel. A young soldier grinning while Declan stood beside him, serious and watchful. "That sounds like Declan." "It does, doesn't it? He was remarkable, in ways I didn't fully understand until years later, when I'd lived enough to recognize what he'd done for me." She wanted to ask. Wanted to know if this was who she suspected, if the voice on the phone belonged to the boy in the photograph, who'd grown into a man whose face she'd seen in tabloids and news coverage for decades. But some questions didn't need answers, and some secrets were kept not because they had to be, but because keeping them honored something larger than curiosity. "Thank you for calling," she said instead. "It means more than you know. Take care of yourself, Mrs. Satterfield, and if you ever need anything at all, you have friends, more than you know." The line went dead. She sat with the phone in her hand, looking at the sky as the last light faded into blue. Thinking about Declan. About the life he'd lived in the shadows, the people he'd touched, the debts he'd accumulated that were still being repaid years after his death. She never found out who called, never confirmed her suspicions, never told anyone about the conversation. But she noticed, in the weeks that followed, that the patrol cars drove past her house a little more often. The officers, the new ones, hired after the reforms, always slowed down, always nodded, as if someone, somewhere, had made a quiet phone call of their own. Thanks for watching to the end. If this story moved you, hit subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, justice isn't always fast, but it's always worth fighting for. The Federal Monitor completed her term in January of the third year. Dorothy Hamlin's final report documented substantial and sustained compliance with consent decree requirements. Training programs had been institutionalized. Civilian oversight was functioning as intended. Demographic disparities in enforcement had decreased by 43% since monitoring began. The sheriff's office wasn't perfect. No institution ever was. But it was different. Measurably, meaningfully different from the department that had arrested an elderly widow for gardening in her own yard. Sheriff Marcus Webb held a press conference to mark the occasion. He spoke about accountability, about change, about the long work of rebuilding trust between law enforcement and the communities they served. Opal didn't attend. She watched from her living room, tea in hand, as the cameras captured a moment of institutional closure that felt both significant and incomplete. "The consent decree represented a reckoning," Webb said. "Not punishment, but acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that we failed the people we swore to protect. This community deserves better. Mrs. Satterfield deserved better. And while we can't undo what happened, we can commit, every day, in every interaction, to being worthy of the trust we're asking people to place in us." He paused. "To Mrs. Satterfield, wherever you're watching, thank you. Your courage changed this department. Your willingness to fight changed this community. We won't forget." She turned off the television. The scholarship fund had awarded its first grant the previous spring. A young woman named Keisha Thornton, first in her family to attend college, pursuing a nursing degree at Georgia State. Opal had met her during the selection process. Seen in her eyes the same determination that had carried Opal through 40 years of night shifts and difficult patients, and the constant small battles that came with being a black woman in a profession that didn't always want her. The memorial garden had been dedicated in September. A quiet corner of the community center downtown, planted with begonias and azaleas, and a small bench where anyone could sit and rest. A plaque read, "In memory of Declan and Opal Satterfield, who proved that belonging is not given but earned, and that the fight for dignity is always worth fighting." Declan's name first. She'd insisted on that. He'd spent his life in the shadows, letting others take the credit, refusing to draw attention to himself. Now, finally, his name was in the light, attached to something beautiful, something lasting. Spring came again. Opal knelt in her garden, turning soil that had nurtured 50 years of growth. The begonias were returning. The azaleas were budding. The cycle continued, season after season, regardless of what happened in the human world that surrounded it. She was 77 now. The knee had gotten worse over the winter, the shoulder never fully healed from what Hensley had done to it. But she could still kneel, could still dig, could still tend the blooms that connected her to Declan, to this house, to the life they'd built together. The new neighbors had children. She heard them playing in the backyard sometimes, their laughter carrying across the fence. The mother had started a garden of her own, and Opal had given her cuttings from the original begonias. The bloodline continued, spreading to new soil. Pastor Rollins still visited on Sundays. Delphine Coates still waved from her porch. The new officers still nodded when their patrol cars passed. The community had absorbed what happened and continued on, change in ways visible and invisible, carrying the memory of that June morning into a future Opal might not live to see. She thought about legacy, about what remained when you were gone. Declan had left his, in the men he'd trained, the lives he'd saved, the quiet acts of heroism that would never be public record. She was leaving hers, in the scholarship students, in the reform department, in the precedent that said elderly widows couldn't be brutalized with impunity. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever was, but it was something. And sometimes something was enough. The begonias bloomed, and Opal Satterfield, 77 years old, widow of a hero, survivor of injustice, keeper of gardens and memories, and a love that time couldn't diminish, lifted her face to the spring sun and let herself feel something she'd almost forgotten was possible. Peace. Not the peace of resolution. There was always more work to do, always more battles to fight, always more ground to gain. But the peace of acceptance, the peace of knowing she'd done what she could with what she had. The peace of a life lived in full, with purpose and passion and love. Declan had written it in his letter. Love like ours doesn't end, it just changes form. He was right. She felt him in the soil beneath her hands, in the blooms that returned each spring, in the quiet mornings and the golden evenings and the ordinary moments that had made their 48 years together extraordinary. He was gone, but he was also everywhere, in everything she touched, everything she tended, everything she'd become because of what they'd shared. The garden bloomed, the house stood, the flags flew, stars and stripes and Union Jack, side by side on the porch where they'd always been, and Opal Satterfield, kneeling in the dirt where it had all begun, let herself smile. The story wasn't over. But this chapter was complete. 5 years later, they came back to Magnolia Lane. Not for a funeral, not yet. For a celebration. The Declan and Opal Satterfield Community Center opened on a Saturday morning in May, built on the site of the old community hall that had served Sycamore Falls for 60 years before termites and time had rendered it unsafe. The new building was modest, single-story, red brick, large windows that let in the Georgia sunlight, but it represented something larger than its footprint suggested. Opal sat in the front row of folding chairs arranged on the lawn, watching as Sheriff Marcus Webb cut the ceremonial ribbon. She was 82 now. The wheelchair had become necessary 6 months ago when the knee finally gave out completely and the doctors said there was nothing more to be done except manage the pain. But her mind remained sharp, her voice remained strong, and her presence at the dedication was non-negotiable. "This building stands as a testament to resilience," Webb said, his voice carrying across the crowd of 300, "to the power of one person refusing to accept injustice, to the community that rallied around her, and to the belief that our institutions can change, must change, when they fail the people they're meant to serve." He turned toward Opal. "Mrs. Satterfield, would you say a few words?" She hadn't prepared a speech, hadn't wanted to. At 82, she'd learned that the best words came unplanned, rising from somewhere deeper than preparation could reach. Drummond wheeled her to the microphone. He was 72 now, moving slower than he had 5 years ago, but still carrying himself with the particular bearing of a man who'd spent his life in service. He'd flown in from Virginia for the dedication. So had McPherson, from London. Blackwood had sent his regrets, a surgery he couldn't reschedule, but his donation had funded the building's medical clinic. "I never wanted to be famous," Opal said, her voice amplified across the lawn. "Never wanted my name on buildings or my face in newspapers. I just wanted to tend my garden and live my life and be left alone." She paused. Let the silence gather weight. But sometimes life has other plans. Sometimes the world decides you're going to be a symbol whether you want to be or not, and when that happens, you have a choice. You can shrink from it, or you can try to make it mean something. She looked at the building behind her, at the plaque by the door that bore her name and Declan's. My husband spent his life protecting people who would never know his name. That was his choice, his sacrifice. He believed that some work had to be done in the shadows, by people willing to pay costs that couldn't be measured or repaid. But there's another kind of work, the kind that happens in the light, the kind that requires names and faces and voices willing to say, "This is wrong, and we won't accept it." Both kinds matter, both kinds are necessary, and I've been privileged, blessed, to be part of both. She found Drummond's eyes in the crowd, found Pastor Rollins, 91 now, but still upright, still present. Found the faces of scholarship recipients who'd come from across the state to honor the woman who'd helped fund their education. This building isn't about me. It's about everyone who comes through those doors looking for help. The children who will learn in these classrooms, the families who will gather in this hall, the people who will find medical care in this clinic when they can't afford it anywhere else. That's the legacy I wanted. Not fame, not recognition. Just this. A place where people belong, where no one gets turned away because of how they look or where they come from or who their neighbors think they should be. She smiled. My husband would have hated all this fuss. He'd be in the back row, arms crossed, waiting for everyone to stop talking so he could go home and work in the garden. Laughter rippled through the crowd. But I think he'd also be proud. Proud that something good came from something terrible. Proud that his name is attached to a place that helps people heal. She looked at the sky. Clear blue. The kind of day Declan had always loved. Thank you, all of you, for being here, for remembering, for proving that community isn't just a word, it's a choice we make every day to show up for each other. She nodded to Drummond, who wheeled her back to her place in the front row. The applause lasted longer than she'd expected, longer than she was comfortable with, but she accepted it. Had learned, over these 5 years, to accept the recognition that came with becoming a symbol. Some burdens you didn't choose, you just carried them as best you could. The reception afterward was held in the building's main hall. Opal stationed herself near the entrance, greeting visitors, accepting well wishes, enduring the endless photographs that everyone seemed to want. Sheriff Webb found her during a brief lull. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his jacket pocket. "It came to my office last week, but I wanted to wait until today to deliver it." He handed her an envelope, official-looking, return address from the Georgia Peace Officer Standards and Training Council. "Bradley Hensley," Webb said quietly. "His certification was permanently revoked 3 years ago, as you know, but he applied for reinstatement last month, claimed he'd completed rehabilitation programs, found religion, changed his ways." Opal's hands tightened on the envelope. "The council reviewed his application, reviewed the evidence from your case, reviewed his subsequent conduct. He's been working private security in Florida, and there have been incidents. Nothing criminal, but patterns." He paused. "They denied reinstatement. Permanently. That letter is formal notification that Bradley Hensley will never wear a badge again. Anywhere in Georgia. Ever." She opened the envelope, read the single page inside. The language was bureaucratic, but the meaning was clear. Closure. Real closure. The kind that came not from dramatic confrontation, but from systems finally working the way they were supposed to. "Thank you," she said, "for bringing this to me personally. You deserve to know. You deserve to see it in writing." Webb's expression carried something that might have been admiration, might have been gratitude, might have been both. "What happened to you changed this department, changed this county, changed me. I wanted you to know that the change is permanent." He moved on to greet other guests. Opal sat with the letter in her lap, reading it again, letting the words sink into the place where the old wound had never quite healed. Hensley would never hurt anyone else the way he'd hurt her. Would never wear a badge. Would spend the rest of his life carrying the weight of what he'd done, visible in every background check, every job application, every Google search of his name. It wasn't prison. Wasn't the dramatic punishment that movies suggested justice required. But it was consequence. Real, lasting, inescapable consequence. Sometimes that was enough. Drummond found her an hour later, sitting alone in the memorial garden adjacent to the main building. The begonias were blooming, cuttings from her original plants, transplanted here to create continuity between her private garden and this public space. Getting tired? Getting old. She smiled to soften the words. Sit with me. He lowered himself onto the bench beside her wheelchair. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the light shift through the leaves of the young trees planted around the garden's perimeter. I heard from Mac this morning, Drummond said eventually. He's retiring, finally. Says his knees can't handle executive protection anymore. He's younger than you. He's 70, and he's been running since he was 22. Body adds that up eventually. She thought about the men who'd come when she'd called. 4 of them, originally. Now scattered, McPherson retiring in London, Blackwood still operating in Boston, 2 others who'd contributed from a distance but never visited, their own health and circumstances limiting what they could give. Will you stay in touch? After... She didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. We'll stay in touch as long as they're staying, Drummond said. That's how it works with us. The chain doesn't break just because links go missing. Declan used to say that. The chain. He's the one who taught us. What it meant to be bound to each other. What it meant to keep promises, even when keeping them cost everything. Drummond's voice softened. He'd be proud of you, Opal. Proud of what you've done with the years since. I just tried to make them count. That's all any of us can do. They sat together until the shadows lengthened and the reception wound down and the last guest departed. Then Drummond wheeled her back to the parking lot, where the van with the wheelchair lift waited to take her home. Home. 2747 Magnolia Lane. The house she'd shared with Declan for 48 years. The garden where everything had started. The porch where she still sat on warm evenings, watching the light fade and remembering. She'd considered moving after the wheelchair became necessary. The house wasn't designed for accessibility. The doorways were narrow, the bathroom problematic, the garden increasingly difficult to tend. But something kept her rooted. Stubbornness partly, defiance. The refusal to be driven from her home by anything, not by neighbors who'd wanted her gone, not by deputies who'd tried to arrest her, not by a body that was slowly failing. Love, mostly. The house held Declan's presence in ways that transcended memory. His chair still sat by the window, his books still lined the shelves, his garden tools still waited in the shed, unused now but maintained, oiled and sharpened by a service she paid to keep them ready. Ready for what? She didn't know. Perhaps just for the comfort of knowing they were there. The van driver helped transfer her to the wheelchair, then into the house. A home health aide would arrive in an hour. The evening shift, a young woman named Teresa who'd been with her for 2 years now. Until then, she had the house to herself. She wheeled herself to the window that overlooked the garden. The begonias were peeking now, crimson against dark soil, exactly as they'd been that morning 5 years ago when everything changed. On the mantel, the photograph remained. Declan and the young soldier, frozen in a moment that had shaped both their lives. She'd never told anyone about the phone call, never confirmed her suspicions about who'd reached out. But she'd noticed things over the years, small things, unexplainable things. A scholarship donation from an anonymous benefactor based in California, large enough to fund 3 additional students. A letter of commendation from the British Embassy, praising her contributions to international understanding and cooperation. A delivery of white roses every year on Declan's birthday. No card, no name, just the flowers and the silent acknowledgement they represented. Someone was watching. Someone was remembering. Someone with resources and reach and a debt they felt they hadn't fully repaid. She didn't need to know who. The gesture was enough. The summer passed slowly, measured in doctor's appointments and therapy sessions, and the gradual accumulation of small losses that came with being 82 and declining. Her vision was going. Macular degeneration, the ophthalmologist said, manageable but progressive. Her hearing required aids now, small devices that whistled sometimes when she adjusted them wrong. Her heart was tired, beating slower than it should, working harder than it could sustain indefinitely. She made arrangements, updated her will, leaving the house to the memorial fund with instructions that it become a museum of sorts, not of her life, but of the case, of the movement it had sparked, of the long fight for accountability that had reshaped law enforcement across the state. Georgia had passed 3 reform bills in the years since her arrest: body camera requirements, civilian oversight mandates, transparency standards for misconduct complaints. The legislators who'd sponsored them had cited her case in their floor speeches. Her name had become shorthand for a turning point, a before and after in how the state thought about police accountability. She hadn't wanted that, still didn't, really, but she'd learned to accept it, to see her story as something larger than herself, a vessel carrying meaning that others needed even if she'd never sought it. The fall brought visitors. Yemi Adeyemo, now a senior correspondent at a national news network, stopped by to record an interview for a documentary about police reform. The conversation lasted 3 hours and covered everything: the arrest, the investigation, the trial of public opinion, the years of aftermath. "What do you want people to remember?" Adeyemo asked near the end. "When they think about what happened to you, what should they take away?" Opal considered the question. That change is possible. Slow, painful, imperfect, but possible. Systems that seem immovable can be moved if enough people push long enough. Institutions that seem corrupt can be reformed if enough light shines on them. She paused. And that individuals matter. One person refusing to be silenced can set off a chain reaction that transforms everything, not because they're special or heroic or different from anyone else, but because they showed up. They spoke up. They refused to let injustice disappear into the darkness where it feeds. That's how change happens. Not through dramatic revolutions, but through accumulated acts of courage by ordinary people who've decided that enough is enough. The interview aired in November, part of a series on civil rights in the 21st century. Opal watched it from her living room, Teresa beside her, seeing herself on screen and thinking about the strange journey that had brought her from a garden to a national stage. Winter came early that year. The first frost hit in late November, killing the last of the begonias and sending the garden into dormancy. Opal watched from her window as the colors faded and the soil hardened and the world retreated into the patient waiting of cold season. Her health declined with the temperature. A bout of pneumonia in December required hospitalization, 3 days in the ICU, surrounded by machines and monitors, and the urgent efficiency of medical staff fighting to keep her body functioning. She recovered, partially, enough to go home at least, though the doctors warned that her reserves were depleted, her resilience diminished, her margin for error narrower than it had ever been. She knew what they meant, could feel it in her bones, in her breath, in the way exhaustion settled over her like a blanket she couldn't push away. She started writing letters, to Drummond, thanking him for everything and releasing him from any remaining obligation, to McPherson and Blackwood, expressing gratitude for their service to her and to Declan's memory, to the scholarship recipients, encouraging them to pass forward the help they'd received, to no one specific, explaining what the garden meant and how she wanted it maintained after she was gone. She wrote until her hands cramped and her eyes blurred and the words started running together. Then she rested. Then she wrote more. The letters filled a drawer in Declan's desk, the same drawer where she'd found his final message. When the time came, Teresa knew to distribute them. Each one sealed, addressed, waiting for a moment that might be tomorrow or might be months away, but was certainly coming. Christmas was quiet. Pastor Rollins, 92 now, barely mobile but refusing to stop visiting, came by on Christmas Eve with his daughter, who'd driven him from the nursing home where he'd finally agreed to reside. They sat together in the living room, the tree she'd insisted on decorating casting colored light across walls that held 50 years of memories. "You remember the first Christmas Declan and I spent in this house?" Opal asked. 1989. The heat went out Christmas morning. He spent 4 hours in the crawl space fixing the furnace while I wrapped presents in 3 sweaters. Rollins laughed, the sound thin but genuine. I remember him showing up at church that afternoon with grease on his face and a look like he'd just conquered a small army. Proudest I ever saw him. That was Declan. Every problem was a mission. Every obstacle was an enemy to be defeated. She smiled at the memory. He never did learn to just call a repairman. They talked until the evening grew late, and Rollins' daughter gently suggested it was time to return to the nursing home. Opal hugged them both, awkwardly, from the wheelchair but with genuine warmth, and watched them drive away into the Christmas Eve darkness. She sat alone for a long while afterward, looking at the tree, looking at the photograph on the mantel, thinking about all the Christmases that had come before and how few remained. "I miss you," she said to the empty room. To Declan. To whoever might be listening. "I miss you every day. But I'll see you soon. And I have so much to tell you." The new year arrived without fanfare. Opal marked it by watching the ball drop on television, then going to bed before the celebrations ended. She was tired. Always tired now. The kind of tired that sleep couldn't fix, that rest couldn't address, that accumulated minute by minute until breathing itself became an effort. January brought another hospitalization. Heart failure this time, the organ simply wearing out, unable to sustain the demands being placed on it. The doctors were honest. She appreciated that. "We can keep you comfortable," the cardiologist said. "Months, potentially, but the trajectory is clear." She nodded, had known this was coming, had made her peace with it in ways that surprised even her. "I'd like to go home. That can be arranged? Hospice care, in-home support? You won't be alone." "I know." The hospice team set up in her living room, hospital bed where the couch had been, monitors, IV stands, the equipment of dying arranged in the space where she'd lived. Drummond flew in the day after she came home. McPherson arrived from London 2 days later. Blackwood took leave from the hospital and drove down from Boston. The Brotherhood reunited, not for a mission, for a vigil. They took shifts sitting with her, reading to her, telling stories about Declan, the missions they could finally discuss, now that time had declassified what secrecy had once protected. She listened with eyes closed, smiling at tales of the man she'd loved, learning pieces of his life that he'd never been able to share. "Sierra Leone," Drummond said one evening. September 2000, the operation that earned him the CGC. She opened her eyes. They'd never told her the details. She'd never asked. "We were supposed to extract 6 hostages from a rebel compound. Intelligence said light resistance. Intelligence was wrong." He paused. "There were 40 fighters. We were 12. The helicopters couldn't extract us until we cleared a landing zone, and the landing zone was on the far side of the compound. Declan led the assault. Not because he was ordered to, we'd lost command structure in the first engagement, but because someone had to, and he was the one who could see the path through. He killed 12 men that day. Hand-to-hand some of it. The kind of fighting you don't train for because training can't prepare you for what it actually feels like." Opal's breath caught. She'd known Declan was a soldier, known he'd done terrible things in service of necessary causes, but hearing it described, made real and specific, was different. "He got us out," Drummond continued. "All of us, all the hostages. Took 3 rounds doing it, shoulder, stomach, leg, and still wouldn't let anyone else carry the wounded until we reached the extraction point. That's who he was. That's what he did. And that's why we came when you called. Because a man like that, a man who'd give everything for his brothers, deserves to have his family protected, no matter what it costs, no matter how long it takes." She reached for his hand, squeezed with what strength remained. "Thank you for telling me, for being here. Always, Opal, until the end, and after." The end came quietly on a February morning when the light was gray and the garden was sleeping and the house held its breath. She'd been declining for days, sleeping more, speaking less. The hospice nurse had warned them it was close, the particular signs that those who work with the dying learn to recognize. Drummond was with her. McPherson and Blackwood had stepped out for coffee, not realizing the moment was so near. It was just the 2 of them, the widow and the man who'd served with her husband through the worst years of both their lives. Her eyes opened, clear for the first time in days, focused,
Niall, I'm here. Tell them. She paused.
Gathered breath. Tell them it was worth it, all of it. The pain and the fighting and the years of not knowing if any of it mattered. It mattered. Tell them. I will. And the garden. Her voice was fading. The begonias. Someone has to. They will. I promise. They will. She smiled. The same smile from the photograph on the mantel. Younger then, radiant and terrified on her wedding day, looking at a man who'd loved her for 48 years. Declan's waiting, she said. I can see him. And then she was gone. The funeral was held at the community center that bore her name. 300 people attended. More waited outside, watching on screens that had been set up to accommodate the overflow. National news covered it live. The governor sent a representative. The mayor spoke. The mayor, Sheriff Webb, spoke. Pastor Rollins, 93 now, speaking from a wheelchair, delivered the eulogy. Drummond didn't speak publicly. Couldn't, without revealing things that still remained classified. But he stood at the graveside as they lowered her casket into the earth beside Declan's, and he saluted, a gesture that meant nothing to civilians, but everything to those who understood. The grave marker was simple. 2 names, 2 dates, and beneath them, words she'd chosen years ago. Together at last. Together forever. The begonias bloomed that spring without her. Someone maintained them. Teresa, who'd stayed on as caretaker of the property, tending the garden the way Opal had taught her. The crimson flowers opened in May, brilliant against the soil, marking the place where everything had started and ended and continued on. The house became what Opal had wanted, a museum, a memorial, a place where visitors could learn about the case and its aftermath. The wheelchair she'd used sat by the window. The photograph remained on the mantel. The garden tools waited in the shed, oiled and sharpened, ready for hands that would never use them. And every year, on the anniversary of her death, white roses appeared on her grave. No card, no name, just the flowers, and the silent acknowledgement that some debts never stopped being paid.
Thank you for taking the time to watch this video today. If you found the content helpful, please remember to like and subscribe so you won't miss our upcoming episodes. If you have any questions or suggestions, feel free to leave a comment below. We are always here to listen.